Hey, y'all.
Hello.
Evening.
Is it evening?
It is. Nighttime?
Feels,
Yeah.
8 o'clock.
It's been darker a little longer than it had been. Oh, you can see our
Key it off, Bella.
you can see our reading in the reflection.
You're blocking it now. This is the last chapter.
Yeah.
Chapter 15 of this book, which has been terrific.
Peggy is here. Hi.
Yay.
Oh.
Yeah, we definitely want to keep doing that. So figuring out, whether it's just us reading what we want to read or, having the church figure that out too.
Got any suggestions, Peggy? Or any ideas about something? Or
Yeah. That's
anybody
right.
who ends up listening to this, we really would love to hear ideas.
Throw them forward. Yeah. Pass them forward. So I don't think tonight we'll go over time.
Don't think so, but do not be shocked.
Just depends.
So yeah, we're a little sad it's ending, but we're thankful for story, as we've been saying all along, and that God has us in His story, and that we aren't alone, not in time or space. That we open the pages of the Bible and we read stories of people a lot like us, and we read stories from 80 years ago and see that, and that our stories somehow are part of all of this, and maybe one day someone will be talking about our stories. Who knows?
You better start writing. Everyone knows I'm not the writer.
You help make the stories, though.
I mean, I'm just in them.
So, thanks for joining us in this.
The three visions.
Mm-hmm.
Chapter 15.
Want to start out?
Sure.
Okay.
The beauty of Betsy's face sustained me over the next days, as I went from one to another of the women who had loved her, describing to them her peace and her joy. 2 mornings after her death, the count was off at roll call. The other barracks were dismissed. 28 remained in ranks, eyes front. The loudspeaker beeped and a voice came on. A woman was missing. The entire barracks would stand on the Lagerstrasse until she was found. Left, right, endlessly tramping to drive the chill away from weary legs. The sun came up, a wan, wintry sun that did not warm. I looked down at my feet. My legs and ankles were swelling grotesquely. By noontime, there was no feeling in them. Betsy, how happy you are today. No cold, no hunger, nothing between you and the face of Jesus. It's a lovely picture.
I do have to mention here that I went to a memorial service this past weekend, and it was a gentleman that had coached me in college in track and field. And the first thing when I walked in, he died of cancer. He was 80 years old, and his daughter met me and shared with me that he had placed his faith in Jesus in the last week of his life. And and it was
the whole day worthwhile.
It was such a beautiful celebration.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought in that moment of her father, and of her thinking about what she just said earlier in the book, and the same thing she's saying now about Betsy, that oh, I'm missing you, but you're in heaven. Like you're with our good Father. You're with Christ.
Right.
I'm not so sad about that. So
nothing between you and the face of Jesus.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So this was good to be able to celebrate that.
The dismissal order came in the afternoon. We learned later that the missing woman had been found dead on one of the upper platforms. It was the following morning when over the loudspeaker during roll call came the word, Ten Boom, Cornelia. For an instant, I stood stupidly where I was. I had been prisoner 66730 for so long that I almost failed to react to my name. I walked forward. Stand to the side. What was going to happen? Why had I been singled out? Had someone reported the Bible? The roll call dragged on. From where I stood, I could see almost the entire Lagerstrasse, tens of thousands of women stretching out of sight, their breath hanging white in the night air. The siren blew for dismissal. The guard signaled me to follow her. I splashed through the slush, trying to keep up with the strides of her tall boots. My legs and feet were still painfully swollen from the long count the day before. My shoes were held together with bits of string. I hobbled behind the guard into the administration barracks at the opposite end of the Lagerstrasse from the hospital. Several prisoners were standing in line at a large desk. An officer seated behind it stamped a paper and handed it to the woman in front of him. Entlassen, he said. Entlassen? Released? Was the woman free then? Were we all? He called a name and another prisoner stepped to the desk. A signature, a stamp. Entlassen. At last, Ten Boom, Cornelia was called. I stepped to the desk, steadying myself against it. He wrote, brought down the stamp, and then I was holding it in my hand. A piece of paper with my name and birthday on it. And across the top, in large black letters, Certificate of Discharge. Dazed, I followed the others through a door at our left. There, at another desk, I was handed a railway pass entitling me to transportation through Germany to the Dutch border. Outside this office, a guard pointed me down a corridor into still another room. There, the prisoners who had been ahead of me were tugging their dresses over their heads and lining up against the rear wall. Clothing over here, a smiling prison trustee told me. Entlassen physical, she explained. I drew the Bible over my head along with the dress, rolled them together, and buried the bundle at the bottom of the clothing pile. I joined the others, the wooden wall rough against my bare back. Strange how the very word release had made the procedures of prison 100 times more hateful. How often Betsy and I had stood like this. But the thought of freedom had stirred in me, and the shame of this inspection was greater than all the others. At last the doctor arrived, a freckled-faced boy in a military uniform. He glanced along the lineup with undisguised contempt. One by one, we had to bend, turn around, spread our fingers. When he reached me, his eyes traveled down to my feet, and his lips puckered in disgust. Edema, he said. Hospital. He was gone. With one other woman who had not passed, I scrambled back to my clothes and followed the trustee from the building. Day had broken, a sullen gray sky spitting snow. We started up the Lagerstrasse past the endless streets of barracks. Then aren't we to be released? I imagine you will be, as soon as the swelling in your legs goes down, the trustee said. They only release you if you're in good condition. I saw her look at the other prisoner. The woman's skin and eyes were dull, dark yellow. Sick calls stretched around the side of the hospital, but we walked straight through the door into a ward at the rear. The room was crammed with double-decker cots. I was assigned a place on an upper bunk next to a woman whose body was covered with erupting pustules. But at least it was near a wall where I could keep my swollen legs elevated. That was what mattered now, to get the swelling down, to pass the inspection. You want to pick it up?
Sure. Whether that ray of freedom shed a new relentless light on Ravensbrück, or whether this was truly the most savage place yet, I could not tell. The suffering was unimaginable. Around me were survivors of a prison train which had been bombed on its way here. The women were horribly mutilated and in terrible pain, but at each moan, two of the nurses jeered and mimicked the sounds. Even in the other patients, I saw that stony indifference to others that was the most fatal disease of the concentration camp. I felt it spread to myself. How could one survive if one kept on feeling? The paralyzed and the unconscious kept falling out of the crowded narrow cots. That first night, 4 women fell from upper bunks and died on the floor. It was better to narrow the mind to one's own need, not to see, not to think. But there was no way to shut out the sounds. All night, women cried out a German word I didn't know. Scheiber, over and over from rasping throats. Scheiber. Finally, I realized that they were calling for bedpans. It was out of the question for most of the women in this room to make it to that filthy latrine next door. At last, reluctant to lower my legs, I climbed down from my cot and set about the chore. The gratitude of the patients was heart-wrenching. Who are you? Why are you doing this? As though cruelty and callousness were the norm, ordinary decency the marvel. As a wintry dawn crept through the windows, I realized it was Christmas Day. I went each morning to the clinic at the front of the hospital where I could hear the tramping of feet on the Lagerstrasse outside. Each time the verdict was edema of the feet and ankles. Many of those who attended the clinic were, like myself, discharged prisoners. Some had been released months ago. Their discharge papers and railway passes were ragged from opening and refolding. And what if Betsy were still alive? Surely our prison term would have been up together. But Betsy would never have passed the physical. What if she were here with me? What if I were to pass the inspection and she... There are no ifs in God's kingdom. I can hear her soft voice saying it. His timing is perfect. His will is our hiding place. Lord Jesus, keep me in your will. Don't let me go mad by poking about outside it. God, that's so good.
Mm-hmm.
I kept looking for someone to give the Bible to. How easy it would be back in Holland to get 100 others. There were not many Hollanders in the ward who would be able to read the Dutch text, but at last I slipped it around the neck of a grateful young woman from Utrecht. The 6th night I spent in the ward, both bedpans were suddenly and mysteriously missing. In an upper bunk on the center aisle were 2 Hungarian gypsies whose muttering was part of the babble of the room. I never walked past their cot because one of them had a gangrenous foot, which she would thrust in the face of anyone who came near. Now someone screamed out that the gypsies had the bedpans hidden under their blankets to save them the trip to the toilets. I went to their cot and pleaded with them, though I didn't know whether they understood German or not. Suddenly, in the dark, something wet and sticky coiled around my face. The woman had taken the bandage from her foot and flung it at me. I ran sobbing down the corridor and washed beneath the wall spigot in the latrine. I would never step into that aisle again. What did I care about the wretched bedpans? I couldn't bear. But of course I had to go back. I had learned much in the past year about what I could and could not bear. As the gypsies saw me heading down the aisle toward them, both bedpans clattered to the floor. The next morning, the doctor on duty at the clinic stamped the medical approval on my discharge form. Events that had dragged so slow now moved with bewildering speed. In a dressing shed near the outer gate of the camp, I was outfitted with clothes. Underthings, a woolen skirt, a truly beautiful silk blouse, sturdy, almost new shoes, a hat, an overcoat. I was handed a form to sign stating that I had never been ill at Ravensbrück, never had an accident, and the treatment had been good. I signed. In another building, I received a day's bread ration and food coupons for 3 additional days. I was also given back my watch, my Dutch money, and Mama's ring. And then I was standing with a group of 10 or 12 just inside the gate. It's so remarkable that they took such care to hang on to items.
Yeah.
I mean, just that there was organization in all of the chaos and some attempt at making it look good.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Just all for that appearance or whatever.
Yeah.
It is crazy. I mean, what was her prisoner number? Like 7766305. I mean,
66730.
Yeah. 66,000 people, and they kept up with her watch.
Right.
It's crazy.
The heavy iron doors swung open. At the heels of a woman guard, we marched through. We climbed the little hill. Now I could see the lake, frozen from shore to shore. The pines and the distant church steeple sparkled in the winter sun like an old-fashioned Christmas card. I could not believe it. Perhaps we were only going to the Siemens factory. Tonight we would march back to camp. But at the top of the hill, we turned left toward the center of the small town. I could feel my feet swelling in the tight new shoes, and I bit my lip to make myself stride along. I imagined the guard turning around, pointing a scornful finger. Adema, send her back to camp. At the small train station, the guard turned and left us without a backward glance. Apparently, we were all traveling as far as Berlin, then each pursuing her separate route home. There was a long wait on cold iron benches. The feeling of unreality persisted. Only one thing seemed familiar, the hungry hollow in my stomach. I put off getting into my bread allowance as long as I could, but at last reached into my overcoat pocket. The packet was gone. I sprang up from the bench, looking beneath it, retracing my steps through the station. Whether I had dropped it or had been stolen, the bread was gone, and with it the ration coupons. At last, a train pulled into the station, and we crowded eagerly to it, but it was for military personnel only. Late in the afternoon, we were allowed aboard a mail train, only to be put off 2 stops farther on to make room for a food shipment. The trip became a blur. We reached the huge, bomb-gutted terminal in Berlin sometime after midnight. It was New Year's Day, 1945. Betsy had been right. She and I were out of prison. You want to pick up?
Sure. Snow drifted down from a shattered skylight as I wandered, confused and frightened, through the cavernous station. I knew that I must find the train to Ulsen, but months of being told what to do had left me robbed of initiative. At last, someone directed me to a distant platform. Each stop now was agony in the stiff new shoes. When I reached the platform, at last, the sign said not Ulsen, but Olsent, Olsten, a town in Poland, in exactly the opposite direction. I had to cross those acres of concrete floors again. Ahead of me, an elderly man, pink-cheeked from working in the roofless station, was raking bomb rubble into a pile. When I asked him for directions, he took me by the arm and led me himself to the proper platform. I was to Holland once, he said, voice wistful with recollection. When the wife was alive, you know. Right on the sea we stayed. A train was standing on the track and I climbed aboard. It was hours before anyone else arrived, but I did not dare get off for fear I would not find my way back again. By the time the train started up, I was dizzy for lack of food. At first stop outside Berlin, I followed the other passengers into the station cafe. I showed the woman behind the cash box my Dutch guilders and told her I'd lost my coupons. That's an old story. Get out of here before I call the police. The trip was endless. Many miles of track could be traveled only at a crawl. Some sections were gone altogether, and there were indeterminate long detours and many changes of train. Often we did not stop at a station at all for fear of air raids, but exchanged freight and passengers in the countryside. And all the while, out my window passed once beautiful Germany. Fire-blackened woods, the gaunt ribs of a church standing over a ruined village. Bremen especially brought tears to my eyes. In all that wasteland, I saw one human being, an old woman poking at a heap of bricks. In Ulsen, there was a long wait between trains. It was late at night. The station was deserted. As I dozed in an empty coffee bar, my head dropped forward until it rested on the small table in front of me. A blow on my ear sent me sprawling almost to the floor. "This is not a bedroom," the furious station agent shrieked. "You can't use our tables to sleep on." Trains came, trains didn't come. I climbed on and off. And then I was standing in a line at a customs shed, and the sign on the little station building said, Mirwuschans. As I left the building, a workman in a blue cap and blue overalls stepped up to me. "Here, you won't get far on those legs. Hang on to my arm." He spoke Dutch. I clung to him and hobbled across some tracks to where another train was waiting, engine already puffing smoke. I was in Holland. We jerked forward, flat, snow-covered fields glided past the window. Home. It was still occupied Holland. German soldiers still stood at intervals along the tracks, but it was home. The train was going only as far as Groningen, a Dutch city not far from the border. Beyond that, rails were torn up and all except government travel banned. With the last of my strength, I limped to a hospital near the station. A nurse in sparkling white uniform invited me into a little office. When I had told my story, she left the room. In a few minutes, she was back with a tray of tea and rusk. I left the butter off, she said. You're suffering from malnutrition. You must be careful what you eat. Tears tumbled into the hot tea as I drank. Here was someone who felt concern for me. There were no available beds in the hospital, she said, but one of the staff was away and I was to have her room. Right now, I have a hot tub running. The hot light was on. Right? I followed her down gleaming corridors in a kind of happy dream. In a large bathroom, clouds of steam were rising from a glistening white tub. Nothing in my life had ever felt as good as that bath. I lay submerged to my chin, feeling the warm water soothe my scab-crusted skin. Just 5 minutes more, I would beg each time the nurse rapped at the door. At last, I let her hand me a nightgown and lead me to a room where a bed was turned down and waiting. Sheets. White sheets, top and bottom. I could not get enough of running my hands over them. The nurse was tucking a second pillow beneath my swollen feet. I struggled to stay awake. To lie here clean and cared for was such a joy. I did not want to sleep through a minute of it.
I stayed in the hospital at Groningen 10 days, feeling my strength return. For most meals, I joined the nurses in their own dining room. The first time I saw the long table set with silverware and glasses, I drew back in alarm. You're having a party. Let me take a tray to my room. I did not feel ready yet for laughter and social chatter. The young woman beside me laughed as she pulled out a chair for me. It's not a party. It's just supper, and skimpy enough at that. I sat down, blinking at knives, forks, tablecloth. Had I once eaten like this every day in the year? Like a savage watching his first civilized meal, I copied the leisurely gestures of the others as they passed bread and cheese and unhurriedly stirred their coffee. The ache in my heart was to get to Willem and Nolly. But how could it be done with the travel ban? Telephone service, too, was more limited than ever, but at last the girl at the hospital switchboard reached the telephone operator in Hilversum with the news of Betsy's death and my release. In the middle of the second week, hospital authorities arranged a ride for me on a food truck headed south. We made the illegal trip at night and without headlights. The food had been diverted from a shipment headed for Germany. In the gray early morning, the truck pulled up to Willem's big brick nursing home. A tall, broad-shouldered girl answered my knock, and then went dashing down the hallway with the news that I was here. In a moment, my arms were around Teen and two of my nieces. Willem arrived more slowly, limping down the corridor with the help of a cane. We held each other a long time while I told them the details of Betsy's illness and death. Almost, said Willem slowly. Almost I could wish to have the same good news of Kik. It would be good for him to be with Betsy and Father. They had had no word of his tall, blonde son since his deportation to Germany. I remembered his hand on my shoulder, guiding me on our bicycles through the blacked out streets to Pickwick's. Remembered his patient coaching. You have no cards, taunted Corrie. There are no Jews. Kik, are the young and brave as vulnerable as the old and slow? I spent 2 weeks in Hilversum trying to adjust to what my eyes had told me that first moment. Willem was dying. Only he seemed unaware of it as he hobbled along the halls of his home, bringing comfort and counsel to the sick people in his care. They had over 50 patients at the moment. Well, what I could not get over was the number of young women in help: nurses' aides, kitchen helpers, secretaries. It was several days before I perceived that most of these girls were young men in hiding from the forced labor conscription, which had grown more ruthless than ever. And still something in me could not rest until I got back to Harlem. Nolly was there, of course, but it was the Bay too. Something in the house itself that called me, beckoned me, told me to come home. The problem, again, was getting there. Willem had the use of an official car for nursing home business, but only within a radius of Hilversum. Finally, after many relayed phone calls, he told me the trip had been arranged. The roads were deserted as we set out. We passed only 2 other cars all the way to the rendezvous spot with the car from Harlem. Ahead, pulled off onto the snow at the side of the road, we saw it. A long black limousine with official government plates and curtained rear windows. I kissed Willem goodbye and then stepped quickly as instructed into the rear of the limousine. Even in the curtained gloom, the ungainly bulk beside me was unmistakable. Herman, I cried. My dear Cornelia. His great hand closed around both of mine. God permits me to see you again. I had last seen Pickwick sitting between 2 soldiers on the prison bus in The Hague, his poor bald head bruised and bleeding. Now here he was, waving aside my sympathy as though that had been an incident too trivial to recall. He seemed as well informed as ever about everything that went on in Harlem, and as the uniformed driver sped us along the empty roads, he filled me in on all the details I ached to know. All of our Jews were safe, except for Mary Atali, who had been sent to Poland following her arrest in the street. Our group was still operating, although many of the young men were in hiding. He warned me to expect changes at the Bay. After the police guard had been removed, a series of homeless families had been housed there, although at the moment he believed the living quarters above the shop were empty. Even before the house was unsealed, loyal Toos had returned from Scheveningen and reopened the watch business. Mr. Buchers, the optician next door, had given her space in his shop from which she had taken orders to give to our repairmen in their homes. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I made out my friend's face more clearly. There was perhaps an extra knob or 2 on the misshapen head. Teeth were missing. But to that vast, kindly ugliness, the beating had made no real difference at all. Poor Pickwick. Like, we should all draw what we think he looks like.
She's
like,
still describing him as like ugly.
Like a creature.
But you love him.
Yeah. Now the limousine was threading the narrow streets of Harlem, over the bridge on the Sparn, across the Grote Market in the shadow of St. Bravo's, into the Bartelsdorpstraat. I was out of the car almost before it stopped, running down the alley, through the side door, and into Nolly's embrace. She and her girls had been there all morning, sweeping, washing windows, airing sheets for my homecoming. Over Nolly's shoulder, I saw Toos standing in the rear door to the shop, laughing and sobbing both at once. Laughing because I was home, crying because Father and Betsy, the only 2 people she had ever allowed herself to love, would never be. Together, we trooped through the house and shop, looking, stroking. Remember how Betsy would set out these cups? Remember how Maida would scold Yussi for leaving his pipe here? I stood on the landing outside the dining room and ran my hands over the smooth wood of the Frisian clock. I could see Father stopping here, Captain at his heels. We mustn't let the clock run down. I opened the glass face, moved the hands to agree with my wristwatch, and slowly drew up the weights. I was home. Life, like the clock, started again. Mornings repairing watches in the workshop, noons most often bumping on my tireless bicycle out to Bosenhovenstraat. And yet, in a strange way, I was not home. I was still waiting, still looking for something. I spent days prowling the alleys and canal banks nearby, calling Mar Shalal Habaz by his name. The elderly vegetable lady 3 stores down told me that this cat, sorry, I have a messed up in my book. That his cat?
The cat?
Okay, the cat had mewed at her door the night of our arrest, and she had taken him in. For months, she said, the small children of the neighborhood had banded together to bring food to Opa's kitty. They had brought scraps from garbage pails and even tidbits from their own scanty plates, smuggled past watchful mothers, and Mr. Hajbaz had remained sleek and fat. It was mid-December, she said, when he had not appeared one night to her call, nor had she seen him since. And so I searched, but with a sinking heart. And this winter of Holland's hunger, all my searching brought not one single cat or dog to my call. I'm going to pick up.
I missed more than the cat. The Bayeux needed people to fill its rooms. I remembered Father's words to the Gestapo chief in The Hague. I will open my door to anyone in need. No one in the city was in greater need than its feeble-minded. Since the start of the Nazi occupation, they had been sequestered by their families in back rooms, their schools and training centers shut down, hidden from a government that had decided they were not fit to live. Soon, a group of them was living at the Bayeux. They still could not go out into the streets, but here, at least, they had new surroundings and a program of sorts with the time I could take from the shop. And still, my restlessness continued. I was home. I was working and busy, or was I? Often I would come with a start at my workbench to realize that I had sat for an hour staring into space. The repairmen Tooze had found, trained under Father, were excellent. I spent less and less time in the shop. Whatever or whoever I was looking for was not there. Nor upstairs. I loved the gentle people in my care, but the house itself had ceased to be home. For Betsy's sake, I bought plants for every windowsill, but I forgot to water them, and they died. Maybe I missed the challenge of the underground. When the national group approached me with a request, I agreed eagerly. They had false release papers for a prisoner in the Haarlem jail. What could be simpler than to carry this document around the corner and through those familiar wooden doors? But as the doors closed behind me, my heart began to race. What if I couldn't get out? What if I was trapped? Yes, a young police lieutenant with bright orange hair stepped back from behind the reception desk. You had an appointment? It was Rolf. Why was he being so stiff with me? Was I under arrest? Were they going to put me in a cell? Rolf, I said, don't you know me? He peered at me as though trying to refresh his memory. Of course, he said smoothly. The lady at the watch shop. I heard you were closed down for a while. I gaped at him. Why, Rolf knew perfectly. And then I recalled where we were. In the central foyer of the police station, with half a dozen German soldiers looking on. And I had greeted one of our group by name, practically admitting a special relationship between us, when the cardinal rule of the underground was. I ran my tongue over my lips. How could I have been so stupid? Rolf took the forged papers from my shaking hands and glanced through them. These must be passed upon by the police chief and the military overcommand together, he said. Can you return with them tomorrow afternoon at 4? The chief will be in a meeting until... I heard no more. After the words tomorrow afternoon, I had bolted for the door. I stood thankfully on the sidewalk until my knees stopped knocking. If I had ever needed proof that I had no boldness or cleverness of my own, I had it now. Whatever bravery or skill I had ever shown were gifts of God, sheer loans from him of the talent needed to do a job. And it was clear from the absence of such skills now that this was no longer his work for me. I crept meekly back to the Bayeux, and it was at that moment, as I stepped into the alley, that I knew what it was I was looking for. It was Betsy. It was Betsy I had missed every moment of every day since I ran to the hospital window and found that she had left Ravensbrück forever. It was Betsy I had thought to find back here in Haarlem, here in the watch shop and in the home she loved. But she was not here. And now, for the first time since her death, I remembered. We must tell people, Corrie. We must tell them what we learned.
So rich.
Mm-hmm.
Good. That very week, I began to speak. If this was God's new work for me, then he would provide the courage and the words. Through the streets and suburbs of Harlem, I bumped on my bicycle rims, bringing the message that joy runs deeper than despair. Yeah, that bears repeating.
Yes.
Joy runs deeper than despair. It was news that people needed to hear that cheerless spring of 1945. Or in the winter of 2020.
Yes.
No Bride of Harlem tree filled the air with fragrance. Only the stump had been too big to haul off for firewood. No tulips turned fields into carpets of color. The bulbs had all been eaten. No family was without its tragedy. In churches and club rooms and private homes in those desperate days, I told the truths Betsy and I had learned in Ravensbrück. And always at these meetings, I spoke of Betsy's first vision, of a home here in Holland where those who had been hurt could learn to live again unafraid. At the close of one of these talks, a slender, aristocratic lady came up to me. I knew her by sight. Mrs. Behrens de Haan, whose home in the suburb of Bloemendaal was said to be one of the most beautiful in Holland. I had never seen it, only the trees at the edge of the huge park in which it was set. And so I was astonished when this elegantly dressed lady asked me if I were still living in the ancient little house on the Barteljoderstraat. How did you? Yes, I do, but my mother often told me about it. She went there frequently to see an aunt of yours who I believe was in charitable work. In a rush, it all came back, opening the side door to let in a swish of satin and rustle of feathers, a long gown and a plumed hat brushing both sides of the narrow stairs. Then Tante Jan standing in her doorway with a look that froze in the bones the thought of bouncing a ball. I am a widow, Mrs. Behrens de Haan was saying, but I have 5 sons in the resistance. 4 are still alive and well. The 5th we have not heard from since he was taken to Germany. As you spoke just now, something in me kept saying, Jan will come back, and in gratitude, you will open your home for this vision of Betsy Ten Boom. It was 2 weeks later that a small boy delivered a scented envelope to the side door. Inside, in slanted purple letters, was a single line. Jan is home. Miss Behrens de Haan herself met me at the entrance of her estate. Together we walked up an avenue of ancient oaks, meeting above our heads. Rounding the final bend, we saw it. A 56-room mansion in the center of a vast lawn. 2 elderly gardeners were poking about the flower beds. We've let the gardens go, Mrs. Behrens de Haan said, but I thought we might put them back in shape. Don't you think released prisoners might find therapy in growing things? I didn't answer. I was staring up at the gabled roof and the leaded windows. Such tall, tall windows. Are there, my throat was dry, are there inlaid wood floors inside and a broad gallery around the central hall and bas-relief statues set along the walls? Mrs. Behrens de Haan looked at me in surprise. You've been there. I don't recall. No, I said. I heard about it from... I stopped. How could I explain what I did not understand? From someone who's been here, she finished simply, not understanding my perplexity. Yes, I said, from someone who's been here. I mean, what? Like I knew this was coming, and it still astonished me. Should I keep going?
You can keep going.
The second week in May, the Allies retook Holland. The Dutch flag hung from every window, and the Wilhelmus was played on the liberated radio day and night. the Canadian Army rushed to the cities and food they had stockpiled along the borders. In June, the first of many hundreds of people arrived at the beautiful home of Bloemendaal. Silent or endlessly relating their losses, withdrawn or fiercely aggressive, everyone was a damaged human being. Not all had been in concentration camps. Some had spent 2, 3, even 4 years hidden in attic rooms and back closets here in Holland. One of the first of these is Mrs. Kahn, widow of the watch shop owner up the street. Mr. Kahn had died at the underground address. She came to us alone, a astute, white-haired woman who started at every sound. Others came to Bloemendaal, scarred body and soul by bombing raids or loss of family or any of the endless dislocations of war. In 1947, we began to receive Dutch people who had been prisoners of the Japanese in Indonesia. Though none of this was by design, it proved to be the best possible setting for those who had been imprisoned in Germany. Among themselves, they tended to live and relive their special woes. In Bloemendaal, they were reminded that they were not the only ones who had suffered. And for all these people alike, the key to healing turned out to be the same. Each had a hurt he had to forgive. The neighbor who had reported him, the brutal guard, the sadistic soldier. Strangely enough, it was not the Germans or the Japanese that people had the most trouble forgiving. It was their fellow Dutchmen who had sided with the enemy. I saw them frequently in the streets, NSBers with their shaved heads and furtive eyes. These former collaborators were now in pitiful condition, turned out of homes and apartments, unable to find jobs, hooted at in the streets. At first, it seemed to me that we should invite them too to Bloemendaal, to live side by side with those they had injured, to seek a new compassion on both sides. But it turned out to be too soon for people working their way back from such hurt. The 2 times I tried it, it ended in open fights. And so as soon as homes and schools for the feeble-minded opened again around the country, I turned the Baye over to these former NSBers. This was how it went those years after the war, experimenting, making mistakes, learning. The doctors, psychiatrists, and nutritionists who came free of charge to any place that cared for war victims sometimes expressed surprise at our loose-run ways. At morning and evening worship, people drifted in and out. Table manners were atrocious. One man took a walk into Harlem every morning at 3 a.m. I could not bring myself to sound a whistle or to scold, or to consider gates or curfews. And sure enough, in their own time and their own way, people worked out the deep pain within them. It most often started as Betsy had known it would in the garden. As flowers bloomed or vegetables ripened, talk was less of the bitter past, more of tomorrow's weather. As their horizons broadened, I would tell them about the people living in the Baye, people who never had a visitor, never a piece of mail. When mention of the NSBers no longer brought on a volley of self-righteous wrath, it's convicting. I knew the person's healing was not far away. And the day he said, "Those people you spoke of, I wonder if they'd care for some homegrown carrots," then I knew the miracle had taken place. It makes you just dream, or to think like what could be, and it seems so silly. And this is a book, and
Right.
Yeah, he's saying that's on offer.
Right.
For us and our own unwillingness to forgive and our self-righteous wrath, and I think larger scale for our church family, our neighborhoods, our city.
Yeah. I mean, in that crazy way, that miracle is that place of, like, I'm the guard to Jesus. And that's what he's saying. Like, I am that awful NSB or the it's interesting that The hardest person to forgive was their best friend who
Mhm.
betrayed them.
Mhm.
And wait, that's me. I'm the
Yeah.
best friend betrayer. Yeah, it is. It's wonderful.
You can pick up.
I continued to speak partly because the home in Bloomdahl ran on contributions, and partly because the hunger for Betsy's story seemed to increase with time. I traveled all over Holland, to other parts of Europe, to the United States. But the place where the hunger was greatest was Germany. Germany was a land in ruin, cities of ashes and rubble, but more terrifying still, minds and hearts of ashes. Just across the border was to feel the great weight that hung over that land. It was at a church service in Munich that I saw him, the former SS man who had stood guard at the shower room door in the processing center at Ravensbrück. He was the first of our actual jailers that I had seen since that time. And suddenly it was all there. The room full of mocking men, the heaps of clothing, Betsy's pain-blanched face. He came up to me as the church was emptying, beaming and bowing. "How grateful I am for your message, Fraulein," he said. "To think that, as you say, he has washed my sins away." His hand was thrust out to shake mine, and I, who had preached so often to the people in Bloomdahl the need to forgive, kept my hand at my side. Even as the angry, vengeful thoughts boiled through me, I saw the sin of them. Jesus Christ had died for this man. Was I going to ask for more? "Lord Jesus," I prayed, "forgive me and help me to forgive him." I tried to smile. I struggled to raise my hand. I could not. I felt nothing, not the slightest spark of warmth or charity. And so again, I breathed the silent prayer, "Jesus, I cannot forgive him. Give your forgiveness." As I took his hand, the most incredible thing happened. From my shoulder, along my arm, and through my hand, a current seemed to pass from me to him, while into my heart sprang a love for this stranger that almost overwhelmed me. And so I discovered that it is not on our forgiveness any more than on our goodness that the world's healing hinges, but on his. When he tells us to love our enemies, he gives, along with the command, the love itself. It took a lot of love. The most pressing need in post-war Germany was homes. 9 million people were said to be without them. They were living in rubble heaps, half-standing buildings, and abandoned army trucks. A church group invited me to speak to 100 families living in an abandoned factory building. Sheets and blankets had been hung between the various living quarters to make a pretense of privacy. But there was no insulating the sounds. The wail of a baby, the din of radios, the angry words of a family quarrel. How could I speak to these people of the reality of God and then go back to my quiet room in the church hostel outside the city? No, before I could bring a message to them, I would have to live among them. And it was during the months that I spent in the factory that a director of a relief organization came to see me. They had heard of my rehabilitation work in Holland, he said, and they wondered. I was opening my mouth to say that I had no professional training in such things when his next words silenced me. "We've located a place for the work," he said. "It was a former concentration camp that's just been released by the government." We drove to Darmstadt to look over the camp. Rolls of rusting barbed wire were still surrounding it. I walked slowly up a cinder path between gray-grab barracks. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped between rows of metal cots. "Window boxes," I said. "We'll have them at every window. The barbed wire must come down, of course, and then we'll need to paint. Green paint, bright yellow-green, the color of things coming up new in the spring." And now the prologue, right?
Yeah.
Post
epilogue.
The epilogue, yeah.
The since then.
Mm-hmm.
Together with a committee of the German Lutheran Church, Corrie opened the camp
In Darmstadt in 1946.
Corrie, sorry, that's funny. Okay. It's typos in my book.
Yeah.
Corrie opened the camp in Darmstadt in 1946 as a home and place of renewal. It functioned in this way until 1960, when it was torn down to make room for new construction in a thriving new Germany. The home in Bloemendaal served ex-prisoners and other war victims exclusively until 1950, when it also began to receive people in need of rest and care from the population at large. It is still in operation today in its own new building with patients from many parts of Europe. Since 1967, it has been governed by the Dutch Reformed Church. Willem died of tuberculosis of the spine in December 1946. His last book, A Study of Sacrifice in the Old Testament, was written standing because the pain of his illness would not allow him to sit at a desk. Just before his death, Willem opened his eyes to tell Tien, "It is well, it is very well, with Kik." It was not until 1953 that the family learned definitely that this 20-year-old son had died in 1944 at the concentration camp in Bergen-Belsen. Today, a Ten Boom Street in Hilversum honors Kik. It is well. On the brink of death. As a result of his wartime experiences, Peter van Woerden dedicated his musical gifts to God's service. He has composed many devotional songs, including a musical setting for the Psalms and Proverbs. Today, Peter, his wife, and their 5 children travel all over Europe and the Near East as a family singing group with a message of God's love.
The Sound of Music.
The Von Trapps. Sorry, Von. In 1959, Corrie was part of a group which revisited Ravensbrück, now in East Germany, to honor Betsy and the 96,000 other women who died there. There, Corrie learned that her own release had been the result of a clerical error. 1 week later, all women her age were taken to the gas chambers. Well into her 80s, Corrie continued her why I was struggling with that word.
It's not in mine, so.
Oh, that's why they took it out. We're indefatigable travels.
Indefatigable, yeah. When I heard Corrie speak in Darmstadt in 1968, she was 76, still traveling ceaselessly.
Oh, is
in
your
obedience to Betsy's certainty.
Has yours been different?
Yeah, that they must tell people.
Working in 61 countries on both sides of the Iron Curtain.
Yeah.
To African students on the shores of Lake Victoria, to farmers in a Cuban sugar field, to prisoners in an English penitentiary, to factory workers in Uzbekistan. She brought the truth they learned from Ravensbrück. Jesus can turn loss into glory. I feel like, have I missed anything else in your version?
Not really. No, they just rearranged some of the words.
Okay. Her final years were spent in a pleasant home provided by friends in Orange County, California. They are a series of strokes curtailed first her physical movement, then her writing schedule, finally even her power of speech, but not her ministry. Those who came to cheer the bedridden and speechless old lady reported, marveling that they were the ones cheered, uplifted, challenged. Only the close companions of those last years knew how eagerly she longed for the real home where her family had gone so long ahead. Homecoming fell for Corrie on her 91st birthday, April 15, 1983.
Well, you guys are not able to follow that at all, were you? It's like totally different.
Okay, you should read. There's some things in here that are different.
Yeah, there are. So these are the people who actually stimulated her to write the book.
Right.
That heard her.
John
John and I made some of those trips with her. The only way to catch this indefatigable, they got the word back in. Indefatigable woman, long enough to get all the information we needed to tell her story. Even with an unscheduled evening ahead of us in some hotel room in Austria or Hungary, it was hard to get her to think back. She was impatient with questions about past events. All her attention centered on the next morning's breakfast meeting with local pastors or the coming rally for young people. Oh, those teenagers will be so happy to know that God loves them. Our best talks came during the time she stayed in our home in Chappaqua. Our own teenage kids loved her visits, loved her ability to laugh at herself. Like the time the chocolate ice cream from the first cone she had ever eaten kept running down her hand onto her blouse and shoes. No, Aunt Corrie, you have to lick around the bottom of the scoop. Watch, like this.
That's cute.
It's like watching folks lick the ice cream store down here on, what's it called, where they do the dips.
Yeah.
You have to catch that during a hot summer day. It's hilarious. Most of all, they loved the fact that each of them was so important to her as the loftiest church leader or city mayor. They loved the simple, concrete way she could convey theological abstractions. I remember the time the 13-year-old Liz and I were helping Corrie unpack. And from the bottom of the suitcase, Liz lifted a folded cloth with some very amateur-looking needlework on it. Uneven stitches, mismatched colors, loose threads and snarls. What are you making? Liz asked, bewildered. Oh, that's not mine. That's the work of the greatest weaver of all. Liz looked dubiously at the tangled mess. But Liz, Corrie told her, you're looking at the wrong side. She took the sorry thing from Liz's hand. This is what our lives look like from our limited viewpoint. And then with a flourish, Corrie shook open the cloth and turned it around to display a magnificent crown embroidered in red, purple, and gold. But when we turn over the threads of our lives to God, this is what he sees.
Nice.
And then I think that the rest of it, in her mid-80s, failing health brought an end to her missionary journeys. And Orange County, California, I guess. All renewed. She went home at last. Yeah. I tried to be glad for Corrie when the phone call came from California. She'd waited for her homecoming so long. But death, from the perspective of Earth, means saying goodbye. Feeling my loss, I roamed our house, touching one by one the physical objects she'd given us over the years. An antique brass kettle, a small square picture frame, an even smaller round one. Little things that recalled big truths our friends shared. The kettle spoke to me about priorities. It was Betsy who spied it, dented and soot encrusted, in a junkyard one morning on her way to the market. She bought it with the meat money. Betsy, cried Corrie, coming upstairs from the watch shop. What are we going to do with that old thing? Look, it won't even hold water. It's not meant to hold water, Betsy replied with dignity. Well, what's it for then? It's not for anything. Oh, Corrie, wait till I get the grime off. Can't you just see the morning sun glowing on this spout? I got stew meat instead of roast, she hurried on. You know, stew really is easier for Father to chew, and I'm not hungry today. Oh, Corrie, this kettle will go on shining long after we've forgotten what we had for dinner tonight. And so it did. It shone for the hunted people who found shelter in the Bayeux. It shone for Corrie when she returned there alone from the concentration camp and from her tireless trips to Russia, China, and Vietnam. It shines in our home today, saying, what feeds the soul matters as much as what feeds the body. In the square frame is a piece of yellow cloth cut in the shape of a six-pointed star. Across the star are 4 black letters, Jude, the Dutch word for Jew. When I was in Holland researching Corrie's story, she took me to the home of Meyer Mossel, Eusebius, during the Nazi occupation. We sipped tea while Corrie and Jussi reminisced. You'd take your pipe with you, Corrie reminded him, recalling the practice drills. But you'd forget your ashtray, and I'd have to come running after you. Jussi set down his cup and crossed the room to a massive antique sideboard. From the bottom drawer, buried beneath a pile of table linen, he drew out a scrap of yellow cloth cut in the shape of a star. All these years, I wondered why I saved this thing, he said. Now I know. It was to give to you, Corrie. We picked out the frame for Jussi's star that very afternoon. For years, it hung on Corrie's wall as it hangs now on ours, a symbol, bittersweet as a cross. To me, the star says, whatever in our life is hardest to bear, love can transform into beauty. And the little round frame, it holds a piece of cloth too. Ordinary white cotton, the kind underwear is made of. In fact, it is underwear. A fragment of the undershirt Corrie was wearing when the Gestapo raid came.
Mm.
In solitary confinement in the prison at Scheveningen, the first place she was taken after her arrest, idleness was eroding Corrie's courage. Nolly smuggled a needle and thread into her, but soon the thread was used up. And then Corrie remembered the undershirt. She unraveled a hem, and now animals, houses, faces, she covered the undershirt with embroidery. The design in the round frame is a flower with elegant curling edges and 6 leaves on a graceful stem. You have to look closely to see the flower. The thread, of course, is the same color as the cloth.
Mm-hmm.
And underwear, even a dear friend's. Well, it isn't the most costly of things Corrie gave us, but it was the one that spoke most clearly now that she was gone. The circle of white cotton told me that when we're feeling poorest, when we've lost a friend, when a dream has failed, when we seem to have nothing left in the world to make beautiful, that's when God says, you're richer than you think.
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth, Chappaqua, New York, in September 2005. She wrote that. So
They really, she really enhanced the epilogue.
yeah, that's right.
From my version.
They had to take every advantage, didn't they?
Yeah. That's
I
lovely.
was quickly going to play the national anthem, mainly because I'd never heard it. So that's the Wilhelmus,
Mm-hmm.
which I've never heard. So
This is what he played in the church. Peter played in the church
to get arrested.
rebelliously. Yeah.
It's short. In any case, that's our hour.
It is.
And thank everyone. What a true treat this has been. We will think of something else to read. So
Love to pray, I think.
Yeah. You want to pray?
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Our good Father, we are so grateful for this gift that you've given us in this time that is unlike anything really that's happened in our lifetimes, but also is similar in some ways to the struggles that others have lived. And we're thankful that you give us the gift of stories that are written down, of joy that is deeper than the sorrow of our life, both in the story that we just read and also the story that you wrote from the beginning of time, that we see all throughout the history of the Bible and our lives now, just like that stitching that the daughter thought was such a mess. We trust that you see it all, that you are carefully, lovingly stitching the stories of our lives, and that we're not alone. Not alone. You even give us this time to read over over computers, Lord, to share with each other. So I'm thankful for the folks who are part of that, who are present now or listening later, who've read the book on their own, and thankful for the ways you are unifying us in that. So help us, Father. Help us to hope, and we're tempted to despair. Help us to have faith where it's hard and we struggle to have faith. And help us to know how to risk, Lord, to be called into service that actually says, we will suffer, Father, because you suffered for us, and you're making it all right, though. And so help us. Thank you that you're our hope and that you love us more than we can imagine. And we offer this up to you and pray you receive glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thanks, Redeemer. Have a great rest of the week.
Yes. We're thankful. Grace and peace to you.
Mm-hmm. Good night.
Good night.